Positions Laboratory. His talk today is going to be about building knowledge infrastructure systems through university-supported climate collectives. Dr. Deslatte, we're pleased to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen if I can. Okay. I'm seeing my slides?
Yes, we are.
Excellent. Let's make sure they advance. Okay, wonderful. So thanks everybody for attending. It's an honor to be here. What I'm going to do today is present some work that comes out of an effort to try to assess and kind of evaluate some of the programs that were included in the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act that was passed in 2021 and the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in 2022. And specifically the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program that was part of the IRA from 2022. And this is part of a interdisciplinary sort of research team. This particular study was done in conjunction with an organization out of Washington University called Midwest Climate Collaborative, which is a technical support organization that works with universities, local governments, other technical assistance providers throughout the Midwest, and is aimed at trying to help build essentially collaborative capacity for climate action and climate initiatives. And then, of course, the rest of my co-authors here, Jeffrey Adams, Juwan Young, and Yunjin Zhu, are graduate students, or in the case of Jeffrey Adams, a recent graduate from O'Neill. So what are we researching? Universities, in a word, right? But we're studying universities as technical service providers in the context of this sort of larger concept that we call knowledge infrastructure systems. And so universities, in terms of the research that they provide and distribute and the technical assistance they provide, are really part of a constellation of, as we're all aware, a constellation of other kinds of organizations that try to share information, coordinate, and sort of plug capacity gaps when it comes to climate action and climate mitigation and adaptation. And so universities are just one of these types of organizations, along with state and federal agencies, local and regional governmental authorities, media organizations, community organizations, think tanks, consultants. Basically, if you were involved in developing, curating, or mobilizing technical, scientific, or professional expertise or technologies around climate action, you were part of the club. You were part of these knowledge infrastructure systems. And so after the 2021 and 2022 legislation, kind of across the country, we saw a lot of different kinds of combinations of these kinds of actors coming together to try to help state and local governments, and also just each other, apply for grants, develop projects, conduct planning, and even write grants themselves. So this is kind of a fertile kind of ground the last few years to study the kind of emergence of a lot of these knowledge infrastructure systems related to climate. What we're studying them in the context of is sort of public infrastructure systems. So we use a framework called the Coupled Infrastructure Systems Framework, which kind of breaks down these complex systems into public infrastructure providers, public infrastructure, the actual physical infrastructure itself, the resource system that we're studying, and then sort of the resource users themselves. And in this framework, what you're seeing here is kind of the feedbacks between these different entities. And so the CIS framework can be used to study lots of different types of infrastructure, whether it's energy infrastructure systems, water infrastructure systems, knowledge infrastructure systems, and that's what we are specifically focusing on here, and the various knowledge types that you need to try to tie together in order to do climate adaptation or mitigation. So just as to try to kind of walk you through kind of this figure, if we look at, the public infrastructure, so we think of roads, we think of transit systems as part of this public infrastructure. There are specific knowledge types, right, that are associated with trying to monitor or evaluate the carbon emissions that come from, this type of physical space. And typically what we might rely on are past experience or time series of GHG emissions activities, historical infrastructure, investments or disinvestments, vehicle miles traveled, lots of potential time series essential data that we would classify here as a particular knowledge type, or K1. If we look at the linkage between the resource system and resource users, we might need to look at different kinds of knowledge, right, that would have to be developed. That could be coupled socio-environmental systems. So we might think of that as GHG emissions from growth or contraction of population or changes in land use patterns. And so the interactions essentially between these different types of system components. And that's a different type of knowledge that has to be generated and utilized than the traditional time series data that I was just sort of talking about. If we move down to sort of knowledge type 3, this is sort of linking kind of public infrastructure providers, which are going to typically be local governments or cities or cities or states. These types of the knowledge that they need to sort of develop or curate in order to decide how to invest in public infrastructure in the context of climate is usually some type of climate modeling, right? So they can try to understand how changes in mean or extreme events are likely to impact the robustness of the infrastructure that they need to build. And so this is a kind of yet another different type of knowledge, the probabilistic understanding of climate uncertainties and scenarios. A good example of that would be downscaled climate modeling that could be utilized to design physical infrastructure systems, whatever they are. And then sort of the fourth knowledge type is the ability to actually actively monitor on an ongoing fashion how resource users are changing behavior. And so very quickly, the types of knowledge you need to do climate mitigation or adaptation, particularly at a larger scale, like at a regional scale or a state scale, become very complicated and varied, right? You need different types of knowledge. So our research is actually trying to identify how prevalent these different knowledge types are in climate planning, and also more precisely, what role do universities play, university-led collaboratives, in supporting kind of larger than local climate planning? And do these university-led collaboratives lead to improvements in the quality of the intergovernmental or regional planning that occurred? So these are our two kind of research questions in this study. The study context, as I mentioned already, is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, which was created under the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. It was implemented throughout 2023 and into 2024, and is sort of on hiatus now for the time being, but was essentially a first of its kind nationwide climate planning effort that was initiated. And the way the program worked, the top MSAs, or metropolitan statistical areas in the country, all received $1 million. This was formula funding. They didn't have to apply for it. They got it automatically. And they got $1 million to create what was called a Priority Climate Action Plan, or PCAP. And this is sort of the list of the MSAs, all the MSAs in the country. And the green boxes are the MSAs that qualified for this funding or received this funding. So about 81 metropolitan statistical areas. We see here in the sort of depicted the Chicago Priority Climate Action Plan, or Chicago metro area, and then the Columbus, Ohio Metropolitan Statistical Area, just two that I picked because we interviewed planners from both of these planning efforts. The program also gave funding to states and tribes and territories. And so here we see the 44 or so states in the green that received, in this case, $3 million to do this priority climate action planning. And then the dots, which are not to scale, obviously, are the tribes and territories that received funding. So we have over 80 tribal governments that received funding. And then, like I mentioned, 44-ish / 47-ish states, depending on EPA's count. EPA included Puerto Rico and DC as states, quote unquote, which might have been wishful thinking, but they got classified as states in this planning effort. So the point is, within the span of about a year, the country went from having about 30% of the population covered by a climate action plan to having around 96% of the population covered. So it was a extremely fast and expansive planning initiative that was undertaken. The incentive here for MSAs and states and tribes to participate in this planning effort was they would then be eligible for implementation funding. So they could produce a separate grant that they would then submit to receive implementation dollars for projects in their areas. And so that was on the order of 4.6 billion or so in implementation funding that was going to be kind of tied to these plans they had to develop. So tremendous incentive for a lot of local governments in these metropolitan areas to kind of work together. Now, the challenge here is that a lot of these governments had not worked together before, particularly on climate issues. So in a lot of these collaborations, you had partners who had very little experience doing climate planning and very little experience working with each other. And I should disclose that through the program, I worked as an external reviewer for EPA reviewing these implementation grants. I also sat on a couple of the advisory boards for a couple of these MSAs. So I sat in a number of meetings with a lot of local governments who, as I described, had really not worked together before on a collaborative effort like this. So this was kind of a first of its kind planning initiative, at least in the United States. So the data that we use in this study are the actual plans they produced, these PCAPs. We have 211 of these climate action plans or priority climate action plans. And then, like I mentioned, we did interviews in 4 MSAs where we wanted to primarily just triangulate our findings and sort of assess the pros and cons or strengths and weaknesses of this planning process, which was very rushed. The Biden administration had obviously an incentive to try to get as many of these dollars out the door as possible, and that led to a very compressed time frame for the development of these plans. And the implementation grants as well had to be sort of developed alongside these plans. So it was a very, very rushed process. So the methods that we use here, the first thing we do is use a supervised learning dictionary-based method that comes out of urban planning to assess the quality of the plans. And so there are essentially 7 criteria, which I'll go over in a second, that we score essentially to determine how high quality the plans are. The next step we did was to identify whether universities were involved in the planning process and specifically what type of information they actually provided, so what type of knowledge infrastructure they supported. Again, back to those 4 types that I just went through. And we then further determined whether the university's involvement was passive, meaning they just sort of produced data and had it available on a website, and the planners actually just accessed that data or accessed those tools, or whether the university staff or technical personnel were actively involved in the planning. Were they under contract to do specific planning steps, or were they actively engaged in the process in some fashion? So that was kind of the second step. The third thing we did was just to estimate a Bayesian linear model to examine the relationship between university engagement and plan quality. So we're really just regressing, in this case, plan quality on the type and extent of university engagement to see if it made a difference in the quality of the plan. That's basically what we're looking at here. The fourth step, which I won't get too much into today, was to do a sentiment analysis of our interview data to try to ascertain just positive versus negative valence and sort of attitudes towards this planning process, which the shorthand, it was rushed. So that heavily sort of colored the sentiment of the planning process. Okay, so I mentioned the plan evaluation quality. This is actually what we were coding, these 7 criteria. Did the plan do an adequate job of articulating its purpose, its goals and objectives? Did it do an adequate job of engaging the public? Did it do an adequate job of coordinating across different agencies or different entities, different jurisdictions? Did it have a strong fact base? In other words, what were the data that were actually utilized? Does it address uncertainty in various climate scenarios? Does it identify adequate strategies for what it's attempting to accomplish, so that the goals align with feasible sort of strategies? And then lastly, does it do a good job of laying out the implementation and monitoring approach, and how is the plan actually going to be worked, right? How will they work the plan? Do they detail that? Are there timetables for implementation and responsibilities, et cetera? And so we can, through this sort of machine learning approach, automate the coding of this. So we give them a score, right? They get assigned a score, and then we proceed with the rest of the analysis. So just to jump to the results, were the PCAPs high quality plans? And what we find is in some places they were, right? And so here is sort of the breakdown of the scoring across the different planning criteria. And we see coordination, right? That is the highest score of all these planning criteria. So all 3 groups, essentially, tribal, MSA, and state plans, scored relatively high quality. And where we see the lowest quality, right, is in uncertainty. And that actually is kind of squares with the program design here, because these plans were intended to be shovel-ready strategies that you could use immediate infusion of federal funds to sort of initiate. So they were very much GHG mitigation plans, and really kind of compilations of GHG strategies, right? So they weren't plans, in other words, that were intended to address resilience and the broader sort of uncertainty of climate impacts. One other thing is that we did notice a statistically significant difference in plan quality between the tribal plans and the MSA and state plans, which you see these blue bars are the tribal plans. And the difference, they tended to score lower than the other 2 plans, and that difference was statistically significant. So that's kind of our description of the plan quality. Second part of the analysis here was, do planners actively use university-based collaboratives? Here we also found the answer was yes. So here's our descriptives. Out of those 211 plans, about 56% did engage universities. So there was, in this case, passive engagement. So over half relied on universities to some extent for information, for knowledge, for resources or data. The active use was a little bit lower, right? So about 20% of the plans actively engaged universities in the process of producing the plans. So that showed up in a number of different ways. Sometimes it was contracted, sometimes it was sort of volunteer work. Sometimes it was through separate grants that had been received that they used as sort of a vehicle to coordinate. But roughly, because of the rush time frame, we kind of surmised there was not as much time to sort of build out broader university collaboratives. So only about 20% again used those. Looking at the different knowledge types, we see the most frequent knowledge type was that K2, which is again that socio-environmental interaction data, primarily looking at how changes in population or changes in land use patterns are likely to impact GHG emissions, and so that was the most frequent. We didn't find any cases where the planning entities, these collaboratives, relied on university-based climate science, so actual climate modeling, downscale modeling. The PCAPs that did use that used it through other means. They accessed this type of modeling and knowledge infrastructure from other sources. Okay, what does it mean? Here's just sort of a quick snapshot of some of the universities and collaboratives that we found throughout the plans. They're kind of all over the place. They weren't just Ivy Leagues. They weren't just land grant universities. They were kind of a grab bag of everybody. So we had the University of Memphis, City and Regional Planning Department, the University of Delaware, which has a climate change hub. We have the School of Public Policy at some place called the University of Maryland, Center for Global Sustainability. They were involved. University of North Dakota, University of San Diego, Utah, you name it. We found there were a lot of university, either departments or institutes or centers around the country that did get enlisted to sort of help with this planning effort, which was pretty interesting. Here are the top scoring plans. And so we found actually out of the 211 Baltimore's regional priority climate action plan was the highest scoring. And it scored 22 out of 29 in our quality scoring. We see here kind of a heavy dominance of plans that originated from the South. So I like to make a joke here that this were an SEC Big Ten matchup. The SEC kind of cleaned up in the quality of these plans. The plans that came from Southern states statistically scored higher than the plans that came from the Midwest, where I am. So that was just an interesting finding. And here's kind of an example of what these collaboratives look like, right? So this is out of Johns Hopkins, and it's the Baltimore Social Environmental Collaborative. This was a pre-existing sort of collaboration that occurred. So they were in the Baltimore plan, ready to sort of, have this infrastructure or use this infrastructure that was already built up. They provide a lot of the social vulnerability assessments and things like that some places had to try to build from scratch because they'd just never done this before. So if you had access already to pre-existing kind of collaborative like this, you were probably going to score higher. You're probably going to produce a higher quality plan in this process. Here's another one from Georgia. This is Drawdown, Georgia, where they produce sort of county level sort of climate modeling, and this is a collaboration between Georgia Tech, Emory, Georgia State, and the University of Georgia. That again was pre-existing. This is already set up, and so the state of Georgia and Atlanta were able to rely on this pre-existing university collaborative for their planning purposes. And so our second question is, does this make a difference? Did the universities actually, these university collaboratives actually lead to more improved plan quality? And we also find the answer here is yes. We find that the university engagement specifically, right, this is the extent to which the passively involved universities were passively involved. And this is a posterior probability of 0.999. So 99, essentially greater than 99% chance that the university engagement led to or planners that utilized university engagement scored higher with a 99% chance, right? So that's, I guess, the proper way to interpret the results for this. We find slightly weaker, but still convincing data that the active university engagement increased plan quality or is associated with increase in plan quality here at a 0.92 essentially probability. So in both of these categories, right, so passive and then active, we find that university engagement and university knowledge building what is associated with higher quality plans. And the next question is, well, did this actually lead to any increased probability that you would receive grants? So does the university collaboratives really pay off with funding? And we're still working on that part of the analysis, but we have found multiple examples where university collaboratives did actually help successful implementation grant writers win those grants. So this is an example of a successful university-supported implementation award. It went to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, and it was supported by this broad coalition, right, of Carolina universities and other institutions. And this is through the NOAA Climate Program Office and the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate Health and Equity. And so they actually came in and helped the tribe, in this case, develop the plan, write the implementation grant, and this was the only tribal applicant that won one of these grants. So the an asterisk to this study is that out of the 211 of these plans that were put together, only about 25 of these entities won an implementation award because they again this process was very rushed, and EPA did not receive as many applicants for the applications for the implementation dollars as they expected. So they chose to sort of award a smaller amount and concentrate more of that money in some of those awards that they gave. Okay, so next steps. Like I said, we're now trying to sort of study the effect, the full-on effect of the program design, and what design features would improve sort of equity outcomes for future federal and state investments when we ever do get around to designing another or launching another program like this. Does plan quality, do these collaborations actually lead to more successful implementation awards? And then lastly, how can we kind of configure these university-based networks that are set up, or infrastructures, knowledge infrastructures, to optimize support for similar collaborative efforts. There are, as we're all aware right now, a lot of change happening at universities, and we're actively involved in trying to study how we can reconfigure these institutions to better demonstrate the importance and impact that we have. And so that's sort of one of the future steps for this line of research. And that's all that I've got. Thank you all very much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deslatte. It was very interesting. We'll now have some questions from the audience.
I think while people are thinking about it, I had a couple of questions I had in my notes. Maybe I'll start there and others can jump in. I was really piqued by the graph that you showed where you had low uncertainty and you had shovel-ready projects that the collaborative knowledge used. And I also feel that oftentimes universities and research institutes like ours, we think of like several years ahead, future-ready projects. So do you see a dichotomy, or do you think that we should really be thinking about the shovel-ready projects than future-ready projects, especially given in this climate where funding is limited, right?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think that this is one of the institutional misalignments, right, that I think that we have, where the universities, right, as we're all discovering, there's a new kind of narrative that comes out seemingly every week about the history of NSF and why we have NSF, and we're trying to provide the general science, that supports larger innovations. And I think, as a byproduct of that, there are institutional incentives that are misaligned here. And so a lot of the university in collaboratives that were pre-established, that had been up and running for a while, I think they provide the capacity for these community actors and governments to identify the projects, right? And so I'm hesitant to say universities and university collaboratives should be telling cities and counties and metro areas like what projects they should initiate. But I think that in this instance, in this program, in places where the regions had not collaborated before, or where the state, like the lead entity at the state level, didn't have a strong enough relationship with these types of collaborations, there just wasn't enough time for the university support to facilitate the development of the shovel-ready projects. So what happened in many instances was cities or counties, governments that had things they'd already wanted to do just kind of threw them in the pipeline, and then the university came in and maybe provided some scientific expertise or some technical expertise, right, for how much a particular activity was going to mitigate emissions, for example. And so there was a difficult time making that marriage work in the anecdotal cases that we've delved a little deeper into. I think it speaks to the need for more climate collaboratives that are going to be more sort of longer term and set up like the Georgia example that I used, or set up like the Carolina example that I used, because those then just become this capacity multiplier that is there that lets governments, do their own thinking about what kinds of projects they could initiate, right? And as opposed to, again, the university trying to tell a community what kind of project to do. We can definitely score the mitigation impacts of different types of projects. But as a long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but I do get hesitant about trying to lecture local governments about what to do.
Well, I actually have a follow-up, but I'll wait to see if anybody else wants to go first.
I do have a question. So you provided a summary of scoring for the different climate collaboratives. Given that these were based on regions, do you feel that certain regions are obviously impacted differently, right, in terms of climate? Would their action plans, their priority action plans, then obviously take that into consideration and therefore affect their scoring? So some could be dealing with more complex issues, others lighter or less complex issues, and how was that taken into consideration in your assessment?
Yeah, it's a great question. The scoring methodology it's been developed in urban planning, and it's designed to be fairly universal or generic. In other words, across those 7 planning criteria, there are actually about 122 different metrics, and most of those metrics just kind of ask, did they engage in for example, a social vulnerability assessment? Did they engage in, collecting, this kind of information? Did they engage in public participation that is representative of the community that they're serving? And so they ask these fairly not open-ended, but fairly broad sort of questions that I think might account for some of the regional variation or jurisdictional variation that would otherwise be different across the plans. Because certainly the strategies that they identify in the plans are very different based on the regions of the country, whether they're coastal, whether they have inland flooding, whether they have more legacy pollution issues. And so the strategies themselves are very different and context driven, but the plan doesn't score them based on necessarily the types of strategies that they engage in. It's just, are the strategies pretty encompassing or not?
I can ask a couple questions. So I know I've had an opportunity to talk a little bit to you about this work, but in the absence of university engaged partnerships, were you actually seeing, whether it be like private sector consultants kind of fill that technical gap space? And then the other question I was going to ask is, kind of as they move forward in this process, are you seeing any local governments that have gone through the kind of planning process that are interested in implementation, even if it's not going to be federally supported? Or does it seem like for most of them, that's just going to be the death knell to moving forward with their broader plans?
The second question actually latched into my brain. Can you refresh? What was the first part of the question? Was what again? I'm sorry.
Was really just, in the absence of the kind of university engagement, were there other sort of technical organizations, private consulting groups that kind of filled that space, and did that factor into, your evaluation?
Yeah, so there were several large national environmental consulting firms that did swoop in and were working with multiple entities, and so a lot of times the region. So there has to be a lead unit in a metropolitan area. That might be the MPO It might be a city in the metro area. It might be the central city. Usually the central city, interestingly, didn't want to be the lead unit because they're trying to get the suburbs and kind of rural areas in the MSA to also participate. And if there's a perception that it's the central city doing this, they're going to think, oh, that's a Chicago plan or that's a Baltimore plan and not the region, you know. And so the lead cities tended to not want to be or the central cities tended to not want to be the lead. So that meant somebody else had to do that. And that other entity probably didn't have a whole lot of experience leading a regional climate planning effort, because most places in the country, we only had a handful of regional climate plans to begin with, you know, before this exercise happened. And this program actually was modeled after, EPA modeled it after Chicago. Chicago, with the help of the EU, ironically, developed a regional climate action plan a few years back. And EPA then used that as a model for this regional planning effort. So whatever entity ended up being the lead unit, they usually had to go hire a consultant to help them just sort of keep the train running on time. So those consulting firms played, in some cases, a very central role, in some instances just a tertiary role. And we're very careful in the analysis not to say that university collaboratives are superior to hiring consultants. I would suspect, or I would hypothesize that the university collaboratives would be probably more preferential, particularly if it's a national consulting firm that's just kind of swooping in for a contract and then they're gone again, where that university collaborative is going to stay there, right, and be a community member. So I would expect that to have some advantages long term, but we haven't totally teased that out, and we're careful in the paper to say we're not suggesting one of these options is better than the other. But there was a lot of variation in that, and there was a large role that consultants played. On the second question, yeah, so there were so many, and so I got to see this program has both a researcher but also kind of a participant in the implementation awards, and there were so many really, really strong proposals, right, for projects, for climate mitigation projects across the country. And in the aftermath, when so few of them got funded, there have been a number of efforts that collaboratives like the Midwest Climate Collaborative, which is a co-author on this paper, their director anyway, and other entities like that have done to try to create repositories for these projects. In other words, let's create just kind of a place where we can compile all these good ideas we came up with and then try to find other funding opportunities for them. So I have seen there has been a lot of effort like that to try to keep a lot of these ideas alive and keep them kind of in the hopper for future funding opportunities wherever they materialize. It's also worth mentioning that there are this program called for a second round of climate planning, the Comprehensive Climate Action Plans, or CCAPs, which were supposed to be completed this year and submitted to EPA by the end of the year. I don't think that EPA is still requiring that they complete these projects. I don't know for a fact. They're kind of busy right now, but there are a number of states and MSAs that, because they got the money, they're continuing with that comprehensive climate action plan. In some places they've gone radio silent, but there are a number of places around the country that are still involved in this second iteration of planning. And those comprehensive climate action plans are supposed to account for more adaptation focused sort of strategies. So the social vulnerability assessments and that kind of those efforts are going to play a larger role in those comprehensive climate action plans, I would guess.
I had a follow-up from my earlier question and also what Eric was talking about. I was thinking of adopting a model like what you were describing for matchmaking between universities and state and local governments. So we recently had a workshop where I was talking to a state government official, and we were talking about AI expertise and how faculty can support several of the efforts that the state wants to do. But just the matchmaking part is so difficult. I think you alluded to that as well. And I was wondering if you can give some advice on, you mentioned consulting and lots of like pieces that go into it, or if you have advice that you could share how to make that matchmaking happen. And do you need like activators or catalysts on both sides to do some, groundwork or anything of that sort? If you can share, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's like the billion-dollar question, I think, is how to get at these incentive problems, right? Or at matchmaking. I like that description too. I think there's, as an example of the incentive alignment that we're all probably familiar with, right? You, as a professor in a research lab or in a department, this kind of work typically only counts towards your service requirements, right? Your service obligations and not your research obligations. And so I think something that seems to work really well is when there is a research objective that is satisfied on the part of the university center or collaborative. And that can require the professors, the researchers, to think more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary about research that is that has shorter term impact that can be realized or at least studied, right, and demonstrated. And so I think what I would suggest is that we are trained, I think, if we're familiar with NSF at all, to think about broader impacts and to take those very seriously. And I think doubling down on those, which we all think about anyway, and it's part of our work. Maybe sometimes we treat it as kind of perfunctory when we're writing a grant, that we have to demonstrate broader impacts, or maybe we're unclear what the broader impacts would be. But really focusing on those and beefing those up, I think helps this translation problem, right? There's a pretty significant translation problem between practitioners who need to solve immediate problems or short-term problems, and then the research community that wants to do good work and wants to make an impact, but has to go through a laborious and slow process oftentimes to be confident in what they're doing or recommending. So it's I don't think it's a cop out, but I think that broader impact has to be something that we adapt to as researchers, to taking more seriously. And I don't mean to suggest that no one's taking it seriously, but it needs to become a larger part of, I think, of how we conceptualize research programs and projects, and that will go a long way to at a larger scale, overcoming this negative perception that universities don't provide benefits to society or to communities, which we all know is not correct, right? But being able to demonstrate those impacts and quantify them, I think would be very convincing, right? Not just to the general public, but also to potential partners.
And I think you need sort of an equal readiness level on the partner side as well, right? I imagine like these partners are fairly mature, at least the ones that you were talking about. They had specific plans in place of what they needed and what tools they needed.
Yeah, I also think that there's kind of like a selection process that occurs, right? I think local governments, from their perspective, they really need to see examples of success. They oversample from success stories and really undersample from failures. And so as a result, that they really don't have a strong causal linkage between what leads to success and what doesn't, right? They tend to just look for best practice or things they can imitate very easily. And so I think something that can help overcome that problem is pilot projects, demonstrations, things that can demonstrate, that can show success, and that might mean that out of the 20 potential communities you could collaborate with, there's one or two that are ready to get serious and actually work, and you need to try to use those as potential demonstrations, right, for the proof of concept. So it is kind of an iterative, speed dating almost kind of sort of process, since we're talking about making this marriage work, right? But I think that it really it just takes a one or two successful collaborations, I think, before others are gonna other governments are likely to recognize that.
Any other questions from other people? Josephine, I think, I don't know if there are other questions or.
So if anyone has any other questions, you can always maybe reach out to Dr. Deslatte. His contact information is available, and we will definitely have this presentation available at iHARP on our channel, if that's okay with Dr. Deslatte, of course. And yeah, so I would like to thank Dr. Deslatte for his time. His presentation has been very insightful on many levels, and we will keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For the opportunity to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good one.